Okay, I'll do the mid-bill. I'll put it down there. Okay, well, let's start. Well, I should start with the customary acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we are talking today. I haven't done a presentation for such a long time that I've forgotten the sort of the formula that people are using nowadays, but I must say I've always been a bit, well, I have recently been rather curious about the relationship between the Ngunnawal and Ngambri claims to the land on which Canberra sits, and that curiosity has been sort of transferred to my curiosity about the relationship between the Motu and Koita people of Port Moresby, who are the customary owners of the land on which Papua New Guinea's national capital sits. But I know a bit more about the nature of their claims and the relationship between them, and I'll mention some of that as we go along today. And I do hope that when I go do page down, I'll get to the next slide. Yes, jolly good. Okay. Now, my headings are leaving a little bit off the end for some reason, because Jonathan Laburis is either talking to me or I'm talking to him up in the corner there. But this slide is called the ideology of land ownership, and this is my starting point. It's a concept I came up with a long time ago in about 1997, when I thought that this ideology was a reflection of the resource-dependent nature of Papua New Guinea's national economy, because at that time I was doing a lot of work on mining projects. But now, after my research into what's going on in Moresby, I realise it's really more a kind of reflection of the colonial legacy itself, especially in urban areas. And so I can illustrate what this means with this statement, which is what I call a concrete factoid, namely that 40% of the land in PNG's National Capital District is customary land. And this is an example of a statement which people continue to reiterate because they want to believe it's true, when in fact it isn't true, as I shall demonstrate, and it's getting less true all the time. And it's a statement in the context of the national capital comparable to the one about 97% of the whole of the land area of PNG being customary land, which again is continually reiterated, although I've managed to demonstrate myself in several papers that that is also no longer a true statement. But people obviously want to believe that it's still a true statement, and that's why I would call it an ideology. Now, what are you up to, Jonathan?
No, ignore me, please keep going.
No, all right. Well, let me remind myself. Oh, yes, can I remember what was in the second paragraph? Oh, there's 19 people who've joined here. Hello, Bryant, how are you? Sorry I didn't come to talk to you about the PNG census yesterday, but I'll get on to that shortly. We're still trying to find a mole to enter the National Statistical Office to get hold of the spreadsheet that underlies the claim that there are 10 million people in Papua New Guinea. Of course, we don't believe it. Ooh. Well, I hope you're having fun there.
I don't know if I would call it fun, but
well, you know what you're doing, if you're more than I do. All right, okay. So both of these, and there are many other statements I could add to this, but I'm not going to bore you with them all of those at the moment. But so they belong to this ideology. And the most fundamental expression of that is that every square metre of land in Papua New Guinea, including the national capital, has some customary landowners attached to it, even if it was purchased somehow or acquired from the original owners during the colonial period and therefore transformed into state land or public land by the time of independence. So some of the land in what is now the national capital was alienated in this way more than 100 years ago, even when the British were there, which was a long time ago indeed. And agents of the state, including in this case the National Capital District Commission, maintained that 60% had been alienated in this way by the time of independence in 75. But representatives of the indigenous residents, the Motu Koita people, and they're not just motu coito people, but mainly, continue to maintain that customary rights over this land have not been fairly or fully extinguished. Okay, so here's a recent example. So this year, UN Secretary General turned up in PNG. I'm not entirely sure why he came, but anyway, he came and he went around the place. And one representative of the Motu people of Hanuabada, the big village, he went public with a complaint, which was reported in the national newspapers, that the people of the big village of Hanuabada means big village in the Motu language, had never been properly compensated for the alienation of their land by the colonial administration to create what's now the Central Business District. And he invoked the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is kind of interesting because the PNG government has never ratified it. But whether Mr. Guterres was aware of this or whether anybody else in the room was aware of it at the time is a moot point. I was managed to find, Google tells me this anyway. But despite that, Mr. Guterres began his address to the Parliament by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And it must be said that Motu Koita representatives have been campaigning for greater recognition of their customary rights ever since independence. But the fact remains that their customary rights are still being eroded. Now, there's another narrative here, which I like this newspaper letter to the editor of one of the national newspapers more than 10 years ago. You can read the slide for yourself. I'm not going to go right through it, but basically, this is the narrative which says that Motu Koita people have only got themselves to blame for the loss of their customary rights. I especially like the reference to them sitting around under trees, scratching their crotches or selling betel nut while watching with envy at how the land they sold is now making hundreds of thousands, if not millions, for those they sold the land to. A key part of this narrative is the idea that Highland opportunists are basically taking advantage of the naivety or whatever it is, whatever quality it is, of the Motu Koita landowners to grab their land, right? So now I imagine myself as providing advice to Highland would-be land grabbers about how best to grab this Motu Koita land. But this narrative, the guy who wrote this letter, I don't think he was a Motu Koita person. Oddly enough, I think he was a person who'd actually bought a plot of customary land off the people of Kila Kila village, to which he makes reference here in what is commonly known as the Taurama Valley, which is the site of a fiasco, which I'll talk about later. So it's kind of odd that he's making these remarks about what the Motu Koita landowners are up to. Okay, but this narrative is not just his. I mean, if I was to have an email exchange with Dame Carol Kiddu, for example, she might come up, in fact, she has come up in email exchange with me saying much the same sort of thing. Okay, that basically these young people, these younger generation of Motu Koita people have kind of lost all their customary values that might have prevented them from alienating their land to outsiders, especially to these land-grabbing Highlanders. And so really they can't complain too much. I mean, the problem is a breakdown in their social system and their customary values. Okay, so that's the counter narrative. All right, okay. Now, time to invoke the ghost of James Scott. And here are two maps of National Capital District showing various things. I've extracted these maps from the Urban Development Plan that the NCDC produced in 2020. It's got a 10-year life, so we're halfway through this Urban Development Plan. It's full of maps. It's also full of some rather questionable statements. Nobody can even quite work out how big the NCDC is. So the NCD is. So in all the different estimates, it's somewhere between 240 and 260 square kilometres. I think the reason for the uncertainty is because some people sometimes forget to include Dalgo Island in the total. But what you see here on the left-hand side is a breakdown into the customary and the state land. And you can see here in this sort of middle grey colour that one block of supposedly customary land is on the eastern side of the NCD, and a slightly smaller block is over here on the eastern side, and they're separated by a very large area of state land that was mostly acquired by the time of independence. And within that, you see the formal residential areas marked out here. Okay, those formal residential areas reappear on the map on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, you also see the location of the Motu Koita urban villages, as they're known in the development plan, with these dotted areas here. So down here, we've got Pari village, Vabukori, Kila Kila is here. Then we've got Hanuabada, a big village here next door to the CBD. And then we've got Tatana on this island. Oddly enough, they've left the causeway off that links it to the mainland, but never mind. And we've got Baruni here. Okay. Those are the main urban villages. There's a couple of others which are smaller. Corabasia doesn't even seem to appear on this map, but not to worry. And the other thing on this map is the informal settlements in this light grey colour. Most of which are on state land, but some of which are on customary land. And then, in accordance with Governor Parkop's grand scheme, shared by the member for Moresby North East, Mr. John Cowper, we've got these areas demarcated as areas for the implementation of the settlement to suburb project or programme, which I will mention again later. This is not proceeding as well as might be expected, for a variety of reasons I won't go into right now. Okay, so that we've done seeing like a state. Now I'm just going to outline how my argument proceeds from here. First of all, I'm going to tackle this question of how we figure out how many Motu Koita people there are inside the NCD, or how many customary landowners there are inside of the customary land inside the NCD. Okay, this is rather not as simple a question as we might imagine. Then I'm going to have a look at these things called Motu Koita land groups. And then I'm going to go back to the process whereby land was acquired during the colonial period, and the way in which that process resulted in something which I'm referring to as structuration, following the inspiration of my old lecturer at Cambridge, Anthony Giddens. Other people use different terms, but I'll explain why I'm preferring this one. Then I'm going to talk at 4 alternatives to the voluntary customary land registration system, whereby land groups can acquire titles to customary land. And I'm looking at 4 alternative legal pathways to the alienation of customary land here. For those of you familiar with PNG's bizarre legal system, these are special agricultural and business leases, the process of land tenure conversion, which I'll go into in a bit, compulsory acquisition by the minister, and alienation by agreement with the minister. If any of you have been looking at the Dev Policy blog, you'll see that I have a few issues with what the minister's been up to of late, not only around Nadzab Airport, but also in Lae and also in Port Moresby. But I'll come to that in due course. Then I want to talk about how hard it is to actually put numbers on any of these processes, right? Because of all the muddle and confusion that goes on, especially because of the existence of these alternative ways of getting hold of bits of customary land. And then I go into the informal underworld, where people just ignore the law completely and do their own dealings, private dealings, as they're sometimes called. And I'll talk about, how that is even harder to figure out what's going on there. And then I will get to my conclusions and some additional questions. Okay, so here we are. Let's start with the census. God help us. Here we are. Okay, so these are the census units here, which, so far as I can make out, are meant to be occupied by Motu Koita people. And you see their names as they were registered in the 2011 census. You can see which electorate they're in. So all the motu coita people are either in the Moresby South electorate or the Moresby Northwest electorate. None of them appear to live in the Moresby Northeast electorate, which is full of settlements mainly occupied by Highlanders, but also my own house happens to be in the north, or at least my wife's house is in the Moresby Northeast electorate. So there are some middle-class bourgeois types hanging around there, but not an enormous number of them. You can see the population recorded in the 2000 census, which is generally deemed not to have been too bad, and then the population recorded in 2011, which is generally regarded as a very bad census, though may well turn out to be not as bad as the 2024 census. And you can see some rather odd shifts, like why, for example, would the population of Kila 2 village have gone down from 1,345 to a mere 359 in the space of 11 years? So the changes don't seem to be consistent across these census units. They're certainly not consistent with the idea of a sort of a consistent rate of growth between those two censuses. So when I decided to make a sort of an estimate of what the census might be in 2024, I was more inclined to make a projection from the 2000 figures than to take any notice of the 2011 figures. But now I can't remember exactly how I made the calculation, right? But it doesn't really matter, because so long as Brian and I can insert a mole into the National Statistical Office in the next few, perhaps I shouldn't say that to any benefit of anyone listening from Port Moresby, though I'm sure there's nobody from the National Statistical Office listening, then we might get our hands on the spreadsheet so that we can actually see how many people they think they've counted in 2024 in each of these motu coita census units. And then we will be able to make an assessment, at least of kind of that section of the census, how accurate the figures are likely to be. I still suspect we'll probably end up with about 30,000 people, but I can make some additional comments about that, and these only add to the uncertainty. I mean, the urban development plan in 2020 appears to overestimate the urban village population because it put 30,000 people in Hanua-Bada alone. And if you go back here, Hanua-Bada consists of 1, 2, 3 census units, right? They come, by my estimate, up to about 6,000, 7,000, maybe 8,000 people. So how did they turn into 30,000 people in the urban development plan? I'm not entirely sure. The figures from the 2011 census, as I said, they're unreliable. Those from 2024 will probably be even less reliable. So that's how I got to my estimate, roughly speaking, as I said. But we have some additional complexities here. Some of the residents of these urban villages should probably not be counted as motu coita people, because they're descended from migrants who have moved into these villages or nearby settlements on customary land at various points ever since the Second World War. It's not entirely clear how many of them would now count or be counted themselves as motu coita people or be accepted as motu coita people rather than as migrants who happen to live in urban villages. So that's one thing. Maybe let's see. Yes, there must be some motu coita people living in the formal residential areas as shown on the map, because they have well-paid jobs in the bureaucracy or in business. So they're living in the formal residential areas. So their numbers might offset the numbers of people in the urban villages who are not truly motu coita people. But we don't know the degree to which one set of numbers offsets the other set of numbers. The best estimate, initially I thought, well, maybe the best estimate would be the number of people who are enrolled to vote in elections for the motu coita assembly. Those elections were held earlier this year, and I think it's about 15,000 people were on the electoral roll. But since then, I've spoken to motu coita people up there who found that they'd been deleted from the electoral roll when they went to vote, having voted in all previous motu coita assembly elections, and they insisted that the electoral roll has been corrupted. in this particular instance, just as it has in many of the open electorates and regional electorates in the national elections. And God only knows what's happening in the current LLG elections. That's another topic. Don't want to go into that, so we won't. Okay, so maybe the electoral roll is also not a good indicator of how many motu coita people there are. Some motu coita people, when we get onto the question of how many landowners there are, some of them probably no longer count as customary landowners because all their customary land was alienated during the colonial period. This would probably be true of quite a lot of the people in Hanuabada because the area around Hanuabada is almost entirely alienated. There aren't that many, I suspect there aren't that many people in Hanuabada, motu coita or otherwise, who actually own any customary land anymore. The only bit that seems to be still in their hands is the Burns Peak area. If anybody's driven over Burns Peak on the Poriporina Highway, you will know that this is an extremely barren area where nobody does anything except sell rocks by the roadside. And the people who sell the rocks by the roadside are probably not motu coita people or Hanuabada villages anyway. And some of the remaining customary land in the NCD is owned or claimed by people who actually live across the border in Central Province. So the southern side of Fairfax Harbour is mainly owned or claimed by people from the Coita village of Roku, which is on the coast in Central Province outside the NCD. And some of the customary land in the far northeastern corner is owned by Koiari-speaking people who are not Motu or Coita people at all. Okay, so there we are. That's why it's really hard to count the number of customary landowners, and just as hard as it is to count the number of Motu Coita people, probably even harder. All right, so now we come to the question of these Motu Coita land groups. Now, under the original form of the Land Groups Incorporation Act that was passed in 1974, we know from the National Gazette that between 1993 and 2012, about 20 years, there were 100 applications for land group incorporation from groups that were based in one of the urban villages, the Motu Coita urban villages in the NCD. And although the actual registrations were not gazetted, most of the applications for incorporation were, we think, probably successful. So by 2012, there were at least 100 of these Motu Coita land groups in these urban villages. Now, when the laws were amended to create this system known as voluntary customary land registration in 2009, it meant that there was now an opportunity for these groups to register titles to their own customary land. This had not been possible before. And these amendments came into effect in 2012, 3 years after they'd been passed by Parliament. And when that happened, all the existing ILGs were told that they now had to reincorporate themselves if they wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to register titles to their own land. Since then, to judge from what notices in the National Gazette, which may not be entirely accurate because they may be a bit of an undercount, because sometimes things happen without getting gazetted in Papua New Guinea, about 70 of these land groups, 70 land groups based in the urban villages, some with the same names as those that were incorporated in the earlier period, some with new names, have gained formal recognition from the Lands Department. So, okay, about 70 land groups. But only 8 of these groups have managed to secure formal titles to a combined total of just over 400 hectares of customary land. Now, it's important to understand here that this land is no longer customary land. It's been alienated to customary groups. You can get your heads around that, right? Some people imagine that because it's customary land and customary groups now own it, it is still customary land. Ah, no, the law is very clear. It's now been alienated to these groups. So it is no longer customary land. It just belongs to customary groups. Right. This makes sense in Papua New Guinea. Don't worry. Okay. And here's a little graph showing you the ups and downs of the different kinds of notices that get published in the National Gazette, because under the current legislation, there are actually 5 different types of notices. There's notices of application, there's notices of recognition, there's notices when a group actually submits to the registrar a plan to kind of register a title to its land. And then there's a notice which says, we're about to recognise and issue this title, agree with the plan and recognise the title. And then finally, a notice says, we've done that now. Okay, we've registered a title. All right. But what you can see here, I mean, that's the red line here, that there have been very few of these actual registration notices. They reached a peak in 2017 when there were 12 of them. And since then, there's only been 1. Okay, all right. So clearly the impetus has gone out of this process. And this was recognized at the National Land Summit in 2019, when all the stakeholders present, or nearly most of them, said this system of voluntary customary land registration isn't working because it's not mobilizing enough customary land. And part of the response to that was, well, yes, that's because when these groups actually do get a registered title to what was formerly their customary land, they find that it's not bankable. In other words, they can't use the title as security to get a bank loan. So they're kind of stuck. Okay, they've got a title, but they can't do anything with the land on the basis of having the title unless they've got some other source of income from some friendly entrepreneur or millionaire philanthropist or something who's going to help them develop this land. Okay. All right. So at that time in the National Land Summit, there was a lot of talk about, oh, well, if that system hasn't worked, what other ways are we going to be able to use to mobilize customary land, not only in the NCD, of course, but everywhere else around the country? And some of these alternatives are what I'm going to talk about next.
Sorry, Colin, that graph is just for NCD?
Yeah, that's just for NCD, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's been, the countrywide data is not all that different. There's just a lot more of it, right? So the whole system, you could see 2017 was pretty much the peak year for doing stuff. I won't go into the question of why the different lines go up and down in different ways, because that would involve talking about the way that the Lands Department operates, and I don't want to do that right now. Of course, it's a rather messy story. But what I've done here is to show you the distribution of groups and plans for registration and actual titles issued between the different Motu Koita villages over the period from 2013 to 2024. And that's where you can see the 414 hectares registered down in the bottom right-hand corner. So these are the groups that have had recognition notices published in the National Gazette. That's where the 70 figure comes from. It's actually 68, strictly speaking, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are 2 groups that have actually been registered, but for which there is no registration notice published in the National Gazette, because we know that there are some cases like that. Okay, so between them, those 70 groups have submitted a total of 47 plans. They've notified the registrar of their intention to register titles over their land. And the areas covered by those statements of intent, right, is quite a lot larger than the area actually covered by the titles that have been subsequently issued. 2,181 hectares covered by notices of intent or survey plans, only 414 hectares of actual registered titles, 16 titles. Okay, some groups have expressed their intention to register titles over more than one area. In case you noticed any discrepancies in those numbers, that would be the main reason for it. But I've got another. Yes, I like flying things in, and And I like this one because you can see here that the people of the big village Hanuabada have expressed an intention to register title over more than 1,000 hectares of land. Now, I doubt that between them, they actually have anything like a claim over 1,000 hectares. And insofar as they do, they'd be living on it cheek by jowl. And quite how they'd register titles over bits that other people happen to be living on, I'm not sure. But of course, the fact is not a single title has been issued to the land groups in Hanuabada, not one single title over one single square metre. The reason for that would most likely be that when they submit these notices of intent to register titles, other people object, and then they have a big argument and a big bun fight, and the Lands Department tells them to go away and do something else. That's my assumption. It may be wrong, but I suspect it's probably correct. Okay. Now I go back to this colonial process that I'm calling structuration. And I'm borrowing here from the work of my colleague Michael Goddard, with whom I used to teach anthropology at the University of Papua New Guinea around about 1990 or so. And he did a lot of field work at that time in the Motuan village of Pari, which is where Dame Carol is still living and where Saburi was formerly from. And these are the basic conclusions that he came up with from his investigation of actually what went on with this colonial process of land acquisition. And we need to remember here that during the sort of the later part of the colonial period, colonial officials were quite active in developing rules and procedures for the acquisition of customary land and writing manuals about how you ought to do it and how you ought to make sure that you've done it right. Okay. One of them was a guy called Bramall, and the other one was a guy called McGrath. Both were officials in the colonial administration. Now, from talking to the old folks in Pari village at the time he was doing his field work, and from sort of investigating what he could of the colonial records, which are now very difficult to access, I may add, as Ewan would know from my conversation with him, he came up with this sort of conclusion on which I put my own gloss to some extent. Now, the Motu and Koita languages have two roughly equivalent terms for what have come to be called clans or land groups, and Idahu in Motu and Toneta in the Koita language, which is rarely spoken these days because most of the Koita people speak Motu and have done for quite a long time. These were real social groups, and they had names, and that was fine. And the names still crop up in all these gazettal notices in various combinations. They were not strictly exogamous. Their membership was open to negotiation, and individuals could be affiliated with more than one group. Okay, so to call them patrilineal descent groups and to call them landowning groups was not really quite accurate. But the colonial officials wanted to believe that that's what they were, because they couldn't acquire land from these groups without making the assumption that they were landowning groups, and that they were that's fundamentally what they were, that they existed in order to own land, not in order to do other things like building canoes to go off on the Hiri trade to the Gulf province, or kind of perform mortuary ceremonies, or get together to engage in some kind of economic activity. All right. So by sort of misreading what these things were, the colonial practice of alienating land had the effect of separating land rights, as property rights, from the landscape in which people actually lived and worked. It had the effect of aligning clan genealogies, which these colonial officials loved making genealogies because they'd actually taken courses in anthropology and were taught by anthropologists how to make a genealogy. So they all knew how to do that. So they did a lot of that. Again, what they did is now sort of very difficult to come across because it's lurking in the National Archives or in files that people can't find. But anyway, they did a lot of it. And they align these genealogies with sort of legalistic ideas about inheritance and succession based on sort of, Western legal precepts. And they created a new kind of legal fiction in the form of these patrilineal landowning groups. These being the things that are now getting themselves incorporated and have been for quite a long time. Okay. So, according to Goddard, basically by the time of independence, Motu Koita people have been persuaded to believe in the existence of a traditional social structure that had actually been made up by colonial officials working on assumptions that they borrowed from old-fashioned anthropologists who had themselves been at work in this area, examining the customs of the Motu Koita people and getting themselves confused as well in the process of doing so. All right, okay. So this effectively set the stage for an interminable series of legal disputes that go on to the present day about the distribution of land rights in what essentially was a fabricated social structure. Okay. And this casts a new light on the point made by that guy when he wrote his letter to the newspaper about the young lads sitting around scratching their crotches and selling buai and watching the Highlanders kind of do all these bad things to this customary land. Because in a sense, if they are doing that, and it's questionable whether they are the only people doing it, what they might be doing is something more like what Motu Koita people would have done before the colonial officials got into the process of land acquisition, i.e. just saying, okay, well, you want a bit of land, okay, you can have this bit of land. I'm going to go over there and chew the buai and you can work the land, and then, maybe you'll give me a share of whatever you produce on the land, and that will all be good. Because the idea that they are traitors to a genuine form of traditional social organization might need to be taken with a big pinch of salt if this image of traditional social organization is itself a fabrication based on the practice of colonial officials in acquiring land from what they imagine to be customary landowning groups. Okay, all right. Now, I'm sure that if there's any Papua New Guineans listening to this, they'll say, no, that can't be right. We definitely have clans. We all have unilineal descent groups and they're landowning groups. And I have had so many arguments about this with Papua New Guineans, including my former students over the years, that I'm kind of getting used to it. But I'm going to stick to my guns. Okay. All right, now I'm going to look at the alternatives to the system of voluntary customary land registration by these fabricated landowning groups that are now incorporated land groups with their different names, the 70 groups I mentioned before that still seem to be active today. So we've seen the voluntary customary land registration. We've seen that it's based on those two acts as amended in 2009. It had its heyday between 2014 and 2018. It now seems to be pretty much dead in the water, at least as far as people in the National Capital District are concerned. All right, so now let's have a look at the other things. Special agricultural and business leases. Now, these, of course, fell into disrepute when a commission of inquiry was set up to investigate them in 2011. None of these things have been issued since 2012. But the Commission of Inquiry only examined a very small proportion of the leases that had actually been granted under sections 11 and 102 of the Land Act. It was looking at the big ones, okay? So it only looked at one in the National Capital District, which came to its attention by accident, mainly because my friend Brian Aldrich, who may or may not be zooming into this seminar, actually picked up on it when he saw it being gazetted and thought there was something dodgy about it. So he included it in a spreadsheet which found its way to the commissioners who conducted the Commission of Inquiry. Most of their interest was in these really big leases that have been granted for many of them for what came to be known as agroforestry projects, in which the landowner companies receiving these leases did dodgy deals with logging companies in order to extract the logs from the leases. Obviously, there's no logging companies logging away in Port Moresby. So the only lease issued in Port Moresby that was investigated by the Commission of Inquiry was one lease granted to a rather peculiar operation in Tatana village. But in fact, there were quite a lot of others, as I'll show you in a minute, over small areas in the NCD. And in fact, there's hundreds of these SABLs all over the country, covering relatively small areas, a lot in urban areas, and they're all still valid because they've never been cancelled. Most of them were issued for 99 years, and they're still valid, whoever's got hold of them. Some of them are held by incorporated land groups of the kind I've just been talking about. Some are held by landowner companies, and some are held by individuals or families. All right. I'll get round to the numbers of these things in the NCD in a minute. Okay, and then there's another pathway, which is the Land Tenure Conversion Act of 1963. This has suddenly become a very significant means of alienating customary land in the NCD, as I will shortly show you. So the SABLs had their heyday, 2004 to 2012, but most of them are still valid. They haven't been cancelled by a court. And in fact, the courts have taken the view that the Lands Department never had a right to cancel any of them. Basically because of an obscure principle of legislation called the principle of indefeasibility, for those of you interested in land law, but I won't go into that for the moment. I'll come back to the Land Tenure Conversion Act in a moment. And then we've got these other two processes, which seem to have become even more important, even more recently: compulsory acquisition by the Minister for Lands, or alienation by agreement with the Minister for Lands. And you see there the different sections of the legislation. Now let's see if we can count how much land has been alienated under these other four pathways, aside from the voluntary customary land registration, where we've had about 400 hectares alienated. Okay, the SABLs, here we are. In that period from 2004 to 2012, when they were being issued in fairly large numbers, we've got the type of leaseholder on the left. We've got the one landowner company, which got one lease over 25 hectares of land. That was the one investigated by the Commission of Inquiry. We've got 14 land groups with leases over a combined area of 614 hectares, and 40 individuals with leases over a combined area of 136, making a total of 775. Okay, so the same land groups that were later to be involved in the voluntary customary land registration system were earlier on, before the passage of those amendments in 2009, getting special agricultural business leases over some various areas of land of varying sizes, as you can see. One quite big, more than 100 hectares. Okay, that's a big area in an urban environment. Okay, but none of those leases were investigated by the Commission of Inquiry. The Commission of Inquiry only looked at leases granted to landowner companies, and even then, only at some of them. It did not ever look at any of the leases granted to incorporated land groups or to individuals. All right, so those are the SABLs. All right. But this, even more interesting, is what's going on with applications to alienate customary land by land tenure conversion. Now, we need to know something about the Land Tenure Conversion Act. This was a piece of colonial legislation passed way back in 1963 by the Australian administration, thinking that it would be a device whereby customary landowning groups, as imagined to exist by the colonial administration, could agree to break up at least part of their customary land into individualized portions and allocate them between its members. So they would get a kind of freehold title, and they would become like little petty bourgeois people, right? In a new world of mobilized land where there was no more customary land, you could all have nice private property in land, just like in Australia, and all would be well. All right. Now, this scheme did not work very well. And in fact, when a Commission of Inquiry into Land Matters was set up in 1973, under the self-government of Michael Somare, it said, basically, this was a really bad idea to try and convert customary land into private property. And what we ought to do is to repeal this act, the Land Tenure Conversion Act, and get rid of the body that was responsible for administering it, which was at the time called the Land Titles Commission, okay, and instead devolve all these kind of matters about how land rights should be distributed between the automatic or indigenous citizens of PNG to the new system of local land courts and district and provincial land courts that was set up under the terms of the Land Dispute Settlement Act in 1975. Okay, but that didn't happen. The legislation remained on the books. Nobody could be bothered to repeal it. The Land Titles Commission sort of went to sleep and didn't seem to be doing anything very much. When Kathy Wimp went and investigated what they were up to in the early 1990s, she reckoned that only 10 titles had actually been issued under the terms of the Land Tenure Conversion Act since independence in 1975. Okay, just 10. All right. And the Land Titles Commission continued to exist, but in a sort of semi-dormant or soporific state until 2022, when a new act was passed to create a new body called the Land Commission of Papua New Guinea, which combines the functions of the Land Titles Commission, the old Colonial Land Titles Commission, with that of another body called the National Land Commission, which was set up after independence for a slightly different purpose, which was to find out whether the land alienated during the colonial period had indeed been properly alienated, because it allowed for the possibility that the descendants of the customary owners who had purportedly flogged it off to the colonial administration, right, had a claim that kind of the land had been bought from the wrong people who were not really the customary owners, or it had been bought for the wrong price, or there was something wrong which made the agreements with the colonial administration faulty in some way, and therefore enabled the descendants of the true customary owners to claim compensation, right? Now the problem with the National Land Commission was that a certain commissioner, whose name shall remain nameless because I can't remember what it was anyway, started handing out huge compensation payments to people who probably didn't deserve them, and taking a share of it for himself. And I can remember well the late Lawrence Kalinoi, who ended up being Secretary for Justice, getting very upset about all of this and recommending himself that the National Land Commission be abolished. And it was in fact suspended for quite a while. But now its functions have been rolled in with those of the Land Titles Commission, and these functions have devolved upon this new body called the Land Commission of PNG, which started work last year. And the team from the Land Commission actually came down here in August, and we had some rather interesting conversations with them about what they were up to. But one of the things they're up to is dealing with a sudden upsurge of applications for land tenure conversion under the terms of this 1963 legislation. And a lot of these are in the NCD, surprise, surprise. And you can see on the eastern side, 102 applicants, and then the areas covered by their applications. Again, some applicants make more than one application over different areas. And what the total area is. On the eastern side, 856 hectares covered by applications from 102 different applicants. These are not all, sometimes these are incorporated land groups, sometimes they're individuals. Sometimes the individuals are Motu Koita people, and sometimes they're not, which is what's most interesting about it. Lots of the applications are coming from people who are clearly not Motu Koita people, including 4 present or former members of parliament, and quite a lot of Highland entrepreneurs, which does make it sound like there could be something to that counter narrative I mentioned about Highlanders grabbing customary land in Port Moresby. On the western side, we've got fewer applicants, but an area which is not proportionally smaller. So the median size of the areas covered by the applications is bigger on the western side of town than it is on the eastern side of town. And I'll get back to that in a minute. some of the applications don't specify very clearly their location. They're unspecified. And if you ever wanted to find out which areas these are, you'd have to go to the Lands Department and front up about, I can't remember what it is, 20 kina or 30 kina for each survey plan. And that would cost quite a lot of money. And so I didn't want to go to the Lands Department and fork out this money, because the survey plans should be in the files of the applications themselves that are with the Land Commission now. Okay. Now, what's happened here is that the Land Titles Commission, while it still existed in 2022, put an advert in the newspaper saying, we've got all these applications to convert land in the NCD under this legislation. And we are now telling you by means of this advertisement in the newspapers that we are going to conduct hearings into these applications on a specified date. But the Land Titles Commission died before it could conduct the hearings. I'm not sure what became of the commissioner. He was kind of a bit asleep when I spoke to him at the time, or before that. So then nothing happened with the applications. They sat there. And then the Land Commission, when it took over the functions of the Land Titles Commission, realised it had all these files and these applications. So they published another advertisement in the newspapers, or on their website at least, in February this year, saying, okay, could you people who've applied for these land tenure conversions, could you come along to a call over hearing and tell us whether you're serious? And if so, kind of what you think we ought to do about your application. And then we'll decide whether we're going to hold a formal hearing or not. And then in September, they published another advertisement saying, right, now these are the ones on which we're going to conduct formal hearings. Some of the ones in the list from February disappeared for various reasons, which I'll go into in a minute. But some new ones appeared because some people submitted applications after February this year. So those were in the new list in September. And the hearings were supposed to be held last month, but they weren't held because the deputy commissioner unfortunately died. So they were postponed until next week. But now they probably won't be held next week because the land commissioner's mother has died. And therefore, they'd probably be postponed again. Okay. So I've been trying to figure out, this is the sort of a hole I've been digging into. And it's one of those holes you come across in Papua New Guinea where you can never quite get to the bottom of it because there's always some dirt still left in the hole to be dug out. So I'm still trying to get hold of some of what's in the files. So I've got to now recruit a whole team of researchers in Papua New Guinea to dig into this hole and see what more I can find. But in the meantime, we do know from the advertisements the identities of the people making the applications and how much land they're trying to acquire by this peculiar legal mechanism. All right. What about the last two avenues? Okay, right. Well, this year, between February and August, more than 200 hectares of customary land in 4 different portions was subject to 3 compulsory acquisition notices by the Lands Minister, who is also the Deputy Prime Minister, John Rosso, published in the National Gazette. Now, this is an innovation. Okay, there's been very few compulsory acquisitions of customary land at all in the NCD during the 50 years of independence. So this is a new pathway being explored here. Okay, all these cases appear to have been justified by reference to the settlement to suburb program I mentioned before. In other words, what's happening here is the minister is saying, I've made an agreement with these customary owners whereby I am going to compensate them for the compulsory acquisition of their land, because the terms of compulsory acquisition is that the customary owners have to be compensated in some way. And then the Gazette tells us that what he's doing is leasing the land compulsorily acquired either to the NCDC, the National Capital District Commission, or to an entity called the Moresby North East Development Authority, chaired by the MP from Moresby North East, Mr. John Cowper. Now, interesting thing about Mr. Cowper is that he had applications for tenure conversion with the Land Commission over a total of about 30 or 40 hectares of customary land at the time of the call-over hearing earlier this year. And when he turned up to the call-over hearing conducted by the Land Commission, and they said, "Honourable Mr. Calvert, MP for Moresby North East, are you still serious about your application to convert these 30 or 40 hectares of customary land to your own private property?" And he said, "You don't need to bother with that, Commissioner, because I've already got the land titles." And he produced them from his briefcase. And he said, "The Registrar of Titles has already issued me these titles." And the Commissioner apparently said, "Oh, well, in that case, I guess we'd better not bother with a formal hearing then." So, all right. So you can see there's something a bit odd going on here. Okay, bit odd. All right, won't say any more. All right. Now, this settlement to suburb program is meant, Mr. Cowper and Governor Parkop are the two main sponsors of this. It is meant to create new housing for some of the many people, and we're not, again, another number we're not sure about. Probably 30,000 people have been evicted from informal settlements on state land, not customary land, on state land since 2012. Okay, so it looks like the minister and the governor and the MP from Moresby North East have got together and said, "Look, we can't find any more vacant state land to build new suburbs on, into which we can then decant the people from the informal settlements that we want to demolish. So we better get some customary land and plonk them there instead." Okay. Whether the Port Moresby North East Development Authority or the NCDC has the capacity to build new suburbs on the customary land acquired for this purpose remains a moot point. Okay, but it does look like compulsory acquisition may signal a new phase in the implementation of this program. It doesn't necessarily mean that hundreds or thousands of new houses are going to be built anytime soon. It just means there's another area of customary land that has now been alienated. So now, why this resort to compulsory acquisition? I suspect it may reflect the failure to get anywhere down the fourth avenue here, the fourth alternative avenue to voluntary customary land registration, which is Section 10, which says that customary owners can make a separate agreement with the minister. They can offer, okay, we'll alienate the customary land to you, the government, on condition that you do certain things with it that we'd be happy with, right? So this is sort of voluntary alienation rather than compulsory acquisition. But we don't know how much land has been alienated under that section because the agreements are never gazetted. So there's no gazettal notice which will tell us how much land has been alienated in this way. Okay, so there's another mystery. I'm still trying to find out from Charles Yalla if he'll tell me how much has been done, because he was instrumental in trying to explore that avenue. Now, how are we doing? Right, I'm going to wind up soon, aren't I? So I'm not going to go into examples of this, but I just wanted to say that while we might think then of this process of alienation as a sequence of steps taken along each of these legal avenues, and think of these as pathways that have been opened up at specific moments of time during the colonial period, post-colonial period, it's not as simple as that, because when we start looking at cases, especially at court cases, we see that kind of, one act of alienation gets turned into another one, people get diverted, they get actions get disputed, taken to court, people erect roadblocks, sometimes there's violence, not as much as in the Highlands, of course, but there can be, and there was, in fact, last week, an interesting example of that. And it's often very hard to find out exactly what has been achieved by anyone in this process, okay? It's hard to count the numbers and it's hard to count the achievement. And if I had time, I would go into this sort of thing. Yes, you see what's going on here. The point I want to make, this is the area on the western side of town. And what seems to be happening here is that because of the construction or the enlargement of the road that goes all the way from the central business district, the Napa Napa Road that goes all the way around Fairfax Harbour to the Napa Napa oil refinery, and the other road that heads off up in that top left-hand corner to the LNG project processing plant, the value of land along this road corridor has massively increased since 2012. And what you have then is a very intensive competition amongst the outsiders, including the politicians and the entrepreneurs, to grab hold of bits of the customary land that are near to this road. Okay. I won't go into the cases because we'd be here all bloody afternoon. So I shall move on to my almost to my conclusions, saying that now I want to look at what's going on in this informal underworld to which the letter writer was making reference earlier on. And this is where I invoke the concept of Polanyi's double movement here. There are two kinds of double movement here, by which I mean sort of movement in two opposite directions. There's one bit which involves dealings with between customary owners and informal outsiders on vacant state land who are getting evicted from that land, and dealings with the other outsiders who are encroaching onto customary land. So a lot of the people living in informal settlements who've been getting evicted from them think or have thought that they were actually living on customary land and have actually made arrangements to even sort of pay rent to the people claiming to be the customary owners, when in fact they're not the customary owners because it's alienated land, but the customary owners still think that they have some attachment to it and are therefore entitled in some way to enter into dealings with the people who are living on it. So this has led to all manner of confusion, okay? But the people encroaching on customary land seem to be, by and large, a different category of people, okay? Not people who are previously occupying informal settlements on state land, but other people who've come from somewhere else, often better off than the people who live in the informal settlements. And there's a second double movement going on here, which is between the formal or irreversible alienation through one of the legal pathways I've mentioned before, and the informal or reversible alienation of customary land to outsiders, whether or not they've been evicted from informal settlements. Because it's quite clear that one of the reasons why the customary owners want to avoid often the formal pathways to alienation is because they're irreversible. You can't undo it, okay? Under the principle of indefeasibility, it's gone forever, okay? An informal transaction can be thought to be a temporary one or a reversible one. So if the people that you've leased or even sold land to offend you in some way, then you can kick them off and recover the land, and it's still customary land, okay? Now, of course, we have hardly any reliable statistics on informal transactions, so we have to use anecdotal evidence of various kinds to figure out what's going on there. But what an interesting thing that happened this year is that the Lands Minister and his advisors decided to amend a particular section of the Land Act, which used to say that customary landowners could dispose of customary land to citizens in accordance with custom. So it allowed for informal transactions to take place. That section has now been amended to say, no, customary owners can't informally dispose of land to anyone, full stop. How you stop them from doing it, I'm not entirely sure. And whether that applies to deals, and the point about a lot of these deals is that they underpin the applications for tenure conversion. So the people applying for tenure conversion are basing their application, if they're outsiders, on a deal, an informal deal they've already done with the customary owners, which is in the files, which I'm trying to investigate. And in fact, I came across a former student of mine from UPNG, whose name again shall be nameless, and I saw his name on the list of applicants for tenure conversion. He's from Enga, this guy. And I said, oh, have you actually got your titles through this process? And he said, yes. It was a really exhausting process, but I've got my titles now. And then I saw his name had dropped off the list of the applications to be heard at the hearing. So I think he must have followed the same path as the MP for Moresby North East and got his titles without a conversion order. And when I asked him, I sent an email saying, could you tell me more about the customary owners from whom you obtained the land and how you got it from them? Silence. So, okay. So there we go. So here we are. If we add up the numbers, okay, that's between 1,500 and 2,000 hectares by my estimation. That's 15 to 20% of the customary land in NCD has been formally alienated since 2000. Okay, that would be the most valuable parts. And then we've got the informal ones, which we can't count. And we don't really know whether they count as alienation or they don't. The latest changes to the Land Act, it must be said, in my view, they're not meant to slow down the mobilisation of customary land. They're meant to give the minister more power to issue leases over land that has been alienated, including the land compulsorily acquired by himself. There's no solid evidence the customary system of tenure is being undermined by the possessive individualism of a new generation. That's what the counter-narrative, the letter writer said. This is what's going on. Possessive individualism amongst the younger generation. The older generation believe in the solidarity of the clan and the incorporated land group. No, they don't. There's a lot of them been doing all kinds of dodgy deals and getting into fights with each other. So I don't think there is an existing generation of wise old men amongst the Motu Koita people who do not want to alienate their land at all. The customary owners, I think they've largely lost their battle to reassert rights over customary land that has already been formally alienated, but there's always hope with the Land Commission still listening to their cases if they can get to their files. Urban villages, I think they're not going to be evicted. Unlike the occupants of informal settlements on state land, they're still secure in occupation of their customary urban village enclaves. Nobody's going to kick them out of there. Okay, so even if they alienate all the rest of their customary land, they'll still be safe sitting on the customary land in their urban villages. But I think the norms that come from the ideology of land ownership, they may not stop the process of capital accumulations that's going on. They do, however, mitigate the naked exercise of power by voracious land grabbers, especially those of the Highland variety, because even the Highlanders seem to acknowledge that it is necessary to make agreements with the customary owners, not just find some way of pinching their land by getting a dodgy title out of the Lands Department. Now, back in 2019, the then chairman of the Motu Koita Assembly, Dadi Toka Jr., there was a roadshow through all the urban villages. What did people think about what should be done about all this? Came up with 17 resolutions. I still can't find the document containing the 17 resolutions. I gather all documents in the Motu Koita Assembly disappeared after the last elections to same. So we may never find the document. Somebody must have it. But the chairman said, he said, like, if you don't make drastic changes to the system, whatever the system might have been, all the remaining customary land in the NCD will disappear by 2029. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. None of the resolutions made, as far as I know, has made any tangible result, which was why Mr. Henney was complaining to the Secretary General this year. The prediction, I think, a little bit pessimistic, especially when you look into these cases of muddle and confusion where people get into a complete mess and go round and round in circles and you're never clear what's come out of it. But we don't know how far the Lands Minister is going to go with this new process of compulsory acquisition. And we don't know what's going to happen with these tenure conversion applications. Although the Chief Commissioner does say to me, and I think he's genuine, that he wants to stop any more dodgy dealings, right? So he's not going to issue conversion orders and send them to the Lands Department unless he's convinced that the customary owners are agreeable to the alienation of their land. And he won't do that until he's done something which the colonial officials invented, which was to walk the boundaries of all the areas in question. And that could take him quite a long time. Thank you.